Hi there. Today I'm going to read you a little extract of a book I've been writing. This book tells the story of how a bunch of scruffy Herberts who could really not play anything very well started rehearsing in a derelict caretaker's cottage, and 40 years later that is now one of London, if not the world's premier independent rehearsal and recording studios. It's been a long journey. There's a lot of stories along the way. I've often been asked whether I'd consider writing a book, and I started last year, and it's sort of more or less done. And so I thought I'd give you a little extract of it. The section I've chosen is probably the moment when the false dots realised that there was more to us, and we weren't actually a bad band. Obviously, if you'd read the book, you'd know who the characters are, so I'll just run through so you know who I'm talking about. When I talk about Paul Erkham, Paul was the bass player in the band, but for our first demo, he was actually the lead and rhythm guitarist, along with me. Paul was only 14 when he joined the band, but he was a very, very talented musician, one of the most natural musicians I've ever known. The band had been set up by myself and a guy called Pete Conway, who at the time was my best mate. And we'd put the band together. We'd grown up, we'd gone through primary and secondary school together. When I departed from Finchley Catholic, Pete also left. He became a butcher and I went to Orange Hill School. There I met Boz Bora, who I refer to in this. Boz is another very talented musician. He was playing with the Polecats at the time. They're probably called the Cult Heroes then. And these days he's probably better known because he's been Morrissey's musical director. And the other characterites I refer to it in here are Alan Warner. Alan run Lane Studios. Alan's another brilliant musician, guitarist of the Foundations, someone who's been a really good friend of mine for a very, very long time. Then the other three people, there's Dav, who was the drummer who played on our first demo, which is the period that this talks to. I never actually got to know his second name. He was lent to us by Alan, who thought we needed a better drummer. Then there's Dave Edwards, who is passingly referred to. He was our first drummer. And then there's Paul Marvin. Paul was the son of Hank Marvin. And Paul Marvin, he wasn't a particularly musically talented drummer at the time, but he did introduce us to Paul Erkham, who was at Moat Mount. So that's the background to the characters. I hope you enjoy this. Here we go. When Paul Erkham turned up, we were all quite surprised. He was 14 years old and didn't speak. All he did was roll joints and play really great guitar. I'd show him the chords once and he'd play it. I'd noodle some lead over the top. We called him Erkham. I didn't even know his first name. Paul Marvin had been right. He made the band sound great. Paul brought his girlfriend Jane to a rehearsal. Pete Conway had been on really good behaviour until then, but when Jane arrived, his behaviour became both appalling and truly bizarre. Strangely, Paul didn't say anything. He just sat there skinning up and playing the songs, oblivious to the world. I'd got to know Alan Warner quite well by now. He was regularly rehearsing at the cottage. The cottage was where our studio was at the time. It's what is now Mill Music Complex. Knowing he had a recording studio, we decided that we'd record a demo. I had some modelling money left after buying another guitar and amp. I said I'd pay half if Pete paid half. Paul was only 14, so we agreed that he shouldn't play. We'd written two songs we considered good enough to be hits. They were called She's Not All She Seems and Ride. I asked Alan Warner to come down to our rehearsal and see what he thought. I thought he'd love it. Afterwards, I rang him up for his opinion. He said the songs are good, but Paul Marvin can't really play drums. If you want to do a demo, I'll lend you my drummer, who's amazing. So it was that Dav turned up, and the truth was that he was amazing. So we had 3 rehearsals and went into Lane Studios. The word had got round Orange Hill that the false dots were actually pretty rubbish from people who'd seen us with Dave and Paul. We'd finished the demo. When we finished the demo, many people were waiting for a good laugh at my expense. Once Paul and David joined, I'd banned everyone from rehearsals. I'd told Pete that I wanted to sound like the Velvet Underground, so I play acoustic and electric guitar on the tracks. We worked bloody hard. When the demo was finished, it sounded amazing to us. Excitedly, I brought it into school. I borrowed Boz Bora's cassette player that he carried everywhere with him at the time. A large phalanx of people gathered around in the common room. From the first bar of Ride, the first track on the demo, jaws dropped. Boz joked, "When did you become a proper band?" Several other school bands immediately vowed to book Alan's studios, as he was clearly a genius if he could make the false dots sound that good. To be honest, the sound Alan got was as much a shock to me as anyone else. We'd taped a few rehearsals on a cassette player, and to be brutally honest, it sounded really rough. I'd done some reading up on recording techniques, and I'd discussed it with Alan before the session. As his studio was in a converted bedroom in his house, he couldn't record drums there. We have agreed to record the backing tracks at the cottage. He brought down his kit, and then we'd do the overdubs back at his place. Alan had an 8-track TIAC tape recording machine. This recorded on a 1/4-inch tape. We had a drum kit, bass guitar, rhythm guitar and lead vocals. With the drum being in stereo, that meant we had 2 spare tracks for overdubs backing vocals at it. We decided to double track the vocals, so this meant we had 1 left. I wanted an acoustic guitar. This was a bit of a challenge as I'd only played electric guitars before, but Alan lent me one. I spent the week before the session practicing the chords. Alan also said we could bounce down. I didn't really understand the process. It meant putting 2 different things on 1 track. Alan explained it was all a bit complicated. We recorded the drums, bass, rhythm guitar and vocals at the cottage. Paul Erkham played the rhythm. I just sat around with Alan. We did 2 takes of each song just in case and listened painstakingly back to them. Alan set the recording gear up in the front room so there was cables galore. He explained that when you put mics on the drum, it was vital that as each had a sweet spot. He said that he knew Dav well, it would be easy for him. We booked 8 hours to do the backing tracks and 4 hours to do the mix and do overdubs. We were well rehearsed, so the tracking session went well. It also was agreed that the bass and rhythm guitar would be re-recorded back at Alan's studio. Alan informed us that the drums was the hardest bit. Paul Erkham had a Sound City valve amp. Alan thought it sounded great and suggested that we could keep it. Pete Conway's bass was DI'd and sounded thin. That would be redone as well as the vocals. The plan had been to record 2 songs. Alan suggested that as we were new to it, that would be enough. As we were well rehearsed, we finished quite early, so Alan suggested a 3rd track. A quick powwow with the band resulted in Her Little World being chosen. Pete Conway felt it was our most controversial track and would get us some notoriety. Alan was shocked when he heard the lyrics. He said it was a great track, but the most disturbing thing he'd ever heard. Pete explained that it was his attempt to see the world through the eyes of a deviant psychopath murderer and not his opinion of how people should behave. The chorus was originally meant to be played with a reggae feel, but as we couldn't really get a reggae groove, it became something very odd and added to the whole feeling of derangement. Ride was the story of a naive MP who was being blackmailed by a prostitute. We decided to take a very unsympathetic character and explore his feelings. He has all the power and no power at all. The twist is that he's actually in love with her, as she's the only person who's being honest with him. Funny really, actually. I guess that's sort of something that isn't as rare as I realised when we wrote the song. Not All She Seems was perhaps the best of the 3. When Paul Marvin was in the band, we blagged a rehearsal in Hank's studio. Hank had a little jam with us on the tune and said, "Why don't you try this guitar lick on it?" We did and it sounded great. It was a song about a transsexual who's moved to another town to survive. She keeps her head down, but one day she meets one of the people she used to know and has to run away. At the time we wrote it, there was no recognition of such people at all in British society. It was a bit inspired by Lou Reed's Transformer album, but mostly by a call I heard on the Anna Raben sex phoning on Capital Radio. A pre-op transsexual had run in and said they'd got into a relationship with a straight man who was a bit naive and hadn't told them. She said that this was keeping him satisfied with oral sex, but was terrified of what happened when he found out. Anna Raben was completely flummoxed and advised leaving town. Pete had also heard the call, and we decided that this person was going to be the central feature in a song. Considering we were 16-year-olds and had been to a Catholic school, I'm still quite amazed that we even considered writing such a song. But the False Dots agenda was to do stuff no one else would touch with a barge pole. When we did the backing tracks, Alan sat listening to the songs. He asked what each was about. Pete and myself excitedly explained. Alan would say, that might not get too much radio play. I responded, they said that to Lou Reed when he recorded Walk on the Wild song. Alan said, these are good numbers, but you have to have a few songs that will get radio play. That wasn't top of the False Dots agenda, but it was noted. It was the first time anyone had properly heard the lyrics. Paul Erkham thought they were hilarious. When we went back to Alan's to do the tracking, I realised that I love being in a studio. We wanted to experiment with sounds. We did the tracking, but ran out of time to mix. As we'd hit it off with Alan, he kindly ran off a rough mix onto cassette for us to listen to. We were new at the process. We were amazed. We didn't think it could be improved. With the double track vocals and the overdubbed acoustic guitar, it sounded absolutely great. Pete queried the wisdom of spending another 30 quid on it. I said we'd always agreed we'd do it properly. I rang Alan and asked him if we could do the mix to improve it further. He said, we'll add effects and improve the balance. This meant nothing to me then. When we went back for the mix, Alan said, why don't you put some echo and reverb on the Hank Marvin lead bit? I agreed to be guided by him. I was gobsmacked. It transformed my guitar into Hank's for a second. He did the same on Pete's voice. Alan then advised me to buy a reverb effect as it suits your guitar. And that's the story of our first demo. Big thanks to Alan Warner, who really put the band on the right track. I hope you enjoyed listening to it.